What time is it in South Africa?
1 o'clock afternoon, perfect time for me.
Okay, it's pretty good.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you from a grey and drizzly London. Lesley was saying it was okay in South Africa.
Very cold.
Cold. And Andrew, I can't remember, but it's night anyway, so.
It's dark.
And very hot in New York.
It's hot, okay. This is our latest webinar, moving on from Elephant in the Room. You can all guess what it's about. And we've got a really good panel to talk about this, and I'm looking forward to it. They're going to share their perspectives on what national responses to this particular elephant in the room say about their culture. And they'll debate what scars will run deep and how they think their societies will change. So I'd like to introduce them one by one. Lesley, who I've just discovered, apart from establishing focused qualitative research in South Africa in 2003, is a karate black belt, but she no longer practices, and I'm glad there's a distance between us. So Lesley, would you like to tell us a bit more about yourself?
Hi, thanks, Luella. I'm based in Cape Town, and it's really cold here, which is why I'm layered up with blankets and jumpers. I'm originally from the UK. We moved here in '94. We came from for an adventure in South Africa, and we stayed, my husband and I. I started my business in focused qualitative research and work across South Africa and actually across Africa as well. So I do a lot of work in East Africa, which I love doing. So traveling and just talking to people there.
Good. Second on the list is Andrew. And he, I discovered, is a fellow tenor saxophonist, quite apart from being the MD of the Lab Insights and Strategy in Sydney. And played in a band called the Rain Dogs when at university.
I'm pretty sure everyone would have heard about it, you know, so.
Tell us a bit more about Australia and your job over there.
Yeah, hello everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and looking forward to the conversation. I run an agency over here called the Lab Insight and Strategy. I'm an expat as well. I've been here for 10 years now in Australia, and then I sort of grew up in qualitative research in the UK. Started in the year 2000. I was born in Australia. Actually, my dad's Australian. I was born in Brisbane, and then grew up in England. Then came back to Australia, where I live in Sydney at the moment with my family. And yeah, it's been a interesting few months to say the least.
And finally, we have Hester. Hester is in New York. She is at the Behavioural Architects, and she told me beforehand that she speaks fluently 2 languages, which most people don't. One of which is Dutch, and the other which is Telugu. I think I've got that right.
Yep.
Okay. Tell us a bit more about that and a bit more about your job in New York.
All right. So as Luella said, I work with the Behavioral Architects. I'm an associate director here in New York. We take a behavioral science approach to qualitative research. My background is actually in social anthropology. I did a PhD in social anthropology here in the US, but my work was in South India. I worked as a professor for some time, but I'm now a fallen and reborn academic and doing qualitative research mostly in the private sector.
Lovely. Well, let's kick off then. We've chatted over the past few weeks about the sort of questions that we think would be interesting. So I hope you'll find them interesting too. And how we'll run them is I will ask them and then we'll go through the 3 of you. If there's a mad rush to talk over each other, I will step in, but otherwise I will allow you free rein. And the first one that we thought would be good would be how you describe the response of your national decision makers to the pandemic. And if we could kick off with Lesley.
So there was a national state of disaster announced on the 15th of March, which is actually my birthday, which is why I remember the date. So the president came on and said, obviously this has been growing in other countries and we're setting this national state of disaster now. And a week later he came on and said there's going to be a hard lockdown, which started then on the 26th of March. So that basically meant that we were, apart from essential services going to work, everybody had to stay in their homes. You weren't allowed even to go and exercise. You were allowed to go to the shops, but you weren't, to buy your groceries, but you weren't allowed to exercise, walk your dog, whatever. You were inside, which is fine at the end of summer in Cape Town. But people who live in small homes in townships, that's where it was tricky, where people are living kind of on top of each other and with extended families, then that's where it was difficult. So the world press and the WHO commended the government. It was all very science-based in those initial months. Initial month, there were different levels that they put in place, that kind of risk-based levels. And from the first death being recorded almost as lockdown started, it was a very slow beginning of the curve, but then it started to, the surge kind of started June, I think, and we're now probably standing at nearly 600,000 confirmed cases, but only a low 12,264 deaths. So relative to the number of cases, we're the dubious honor of being the 5th in the world in terms of cases. But the mortality rate is pretty low, and I suspect there's going to be a whole bunch of unaccounted for deaths that then go into that once they start tallying up, looking more closely at figures.
So do you think that original decision was right or wrong?
Yeah, it was definitely right. Everybody was kind of reassured and pleased that it was the right thing to do at the time. But as things have gone on and as we've moved through these different stages of lockdown, I think one of the key things has been alcohol and cigarettes were banned right from the start. And then there was a 3-week hiatus in June when alcohol was allowed, where you're allowed to buy alcohol again. But and the thinking behind it was to try and minimize the effect of the trauma on the trauma units, keep those trauma unit beds open for COVID patients, because they said that the trauma deaths was so high with alcohol related cases. Then the cases went up, the alcohol related cases went up, and alcohol was banned again. So people have really started to lose their sense of humor about, not being able to get cigarettes, not being able to get alcohol, never mind all the people who are dying and really suffering out there, but that's almost been people's biggest concern.
Andrew, I think we'll move on from that. I mean, it has the same issue popped up there. How did the government respond?
Yeah, similarly, I think, in terms of the rapidity or the speed to lockdown. I think it's worth mentioning in Australia the context that led up to this moment as well, or just pre-pandemic. And I don't know, everyone probably remembers the bushfire kind of event, and preceding that there was the drought, but the bushfires were a big deal in Australia, and it left a lot of kind of scars and communities in crisis really around Australia, but also a sense of connectivity, of coming together, of community, of looking after one another, and I suppose being in awe of Mother Nature. There's a whole bunch of things that happen, and the Prime Minister during that bushfire crisis didn't cover himself in that much glory. He went away on holiday at one point and didn't tell anyone, and then he came back and kind of tail between his legs, and there's all this kind of like stuff around his leadership style and how he responded. And I think that precipitated his response a little bit in this crisis, which was, I'm not going to get this wrong again. I'm actually going to make sure that this is the textbook handling of a situation like this. So, and to be honest with you, I can't really say that he did anything went wrong, because the numbers have been so low. they flattened the curve very quickly. It felt very authoritative. There was a lot of good information. Everyone sort of towed the line in Australia and did what they were told. It was well educated. We felt well educated, I think, throughout. There was a general sentiment this has been well handled. There was not too much political debate. It was pretty sort of bipartisan in terms of the response. And yeah, we sort of flattened the curve, and I felt like it was a sort of a matter of national pride for everyone to do that, and that the government the federal government at least have kind of come through this now, with great approval ratings. I think now we're in a second wave in Melbourne and in Victoria, and so now there's this more of a state by state narrative. There's sort of what you've done in Victoria, the Premier of Victoria versus the Premier in New South Wales versus the Premier in Queensland, and sort of more of a localized debate around different policies. But certainly I think it was a pretty textbook response.
Thanks, Andrew. Hester, I feel your pain because
it starts with a T and it's a 5-letter word. Not to get too political on everybody, but I think everybody in the world knows that our national response, and I think, I should say first that in the US, you can't just talk about the national response because it is a federal system, and I'll get to that. I'll take it one by one. I think at a national level, as I said, I think the response has been abysmal. Not only did our president not acknowledge the severity of the pandemic until very late, even as our governors were starting to recognize the severity of the pandemic, our president was still calling it a flu. There was a lot of false information at the national level being spread about how the virus is spread, how it can be cured, how long it will take. And I think that in some ways set the tone for what unfolded, which is that the pandemic became very much politicized in the United States, right? So this was not so much talked in, at least at a subconscious level, in terms of a national health threat, as it was being talked about as, where your political allegiances were. Right. And I think, that at an overall level has led to a lot of confusion. Right. So what are the facts? What should we be doing, etc. On the other hand, of course, in the US, even as our president sets the tone, the people most responsible for intervening in a pandemic such as this is the state or the states, right? So we're really talking about government or governor responses. And there, I think you've seen dramatic differences, right? So I live in New York City, so I'm in the state of New York. I have to say we are lucky enough to have Governor Cuomo, who's been extremely scientifically informed, even-handed, rational about this pandemic. We, of course, had one of the highest death rates in the country, but we've managed to, basically reduce it to, I think it's a 1% infection rate at this point. So the results here have been extremely well-informed and effective, I would say. But then you look at a state like Florida, where you have Governor DeSantis, where again, this issue is very much politicized. This is a governor with strong allegiance to Donald Trump, where, there was really a sense that we should open up as soon as possible. This is just a fluke. This is just something that we can get through by just going back to work. The economy is more important. And of course, in the last 2 months, the Florida death rates and infection rates have skyrocketed. But I think that's really the most important thing to understand about the United States is, at this point at least, where your political allegiance is and what state you live in.
I suppose it's what comes next as well in terms of.
Yep.
Has the general public responded as you would predicted, or has it thrown up any anomalies, do you reckon, Lesley?
Yeah, so I think initially people were a little bit reluctant, you know, wearing masks is now compulsory. So you can't go, you know, out in public outside as well as when you're in shopping malls and inside the shops, you've got to wear masks. There's hand sanitizer. So everybody's following all those hygiene protocols wherever, although you do still see people wearing their masks down here, but, you know, at least they're trying. So that was surprised me, that people kind of took to it relatively quickly. But what's actually surprised me more is the amazing community efforts that have taken place, because hunger is real. There's a lot of, because the economy is has really gone down the sink. There are a lot of people who've lost their jobs, and there are a lot of people who are actually hungry and starving out there. So the community efforts that are happening have been amazing. Large scale soup kitchens, and because the schools were closed for so long, the school feeding schemes weren't in place. So there were children also going hungry. So all of those things have kind of kicked in, and that's been run by civil society. That's not been run by the government. And there's almost like, with the mask situation, there's almost like some public shaming happening. If you walk somewhere, like go out for a walk, and if somebody's not wearing their mask properly, they kind of get eyebrows raised or tutted at or told to wear their mask if you go to the petrol station. So I'm surprised at that how kind of obedient people have been on that front.
So it's not a matter of being enforced, it's community approval.
Yeah, so there's no fine or anything. It is compulsory, but there's no fine that I know of, and it's kind of enforced by individuals towards each other. And it is, you know, you wear masks. And this has been the case for a couple of months now. Initially, you would go to the shops and nobody was wearing masks, and that was before it really set in. And then it became, and there was just a classic moment. The president gave a speech saying that this is now compulsory, and he got his mask out and he said, so everybody wear your mask. And at the end, he put his mask on. I'm sure you've seen it, and he just fumbled, and it was just, you know, heartwarming to see the guy struggling with this. And he made such a joke of it. And it helped everybody to understand the importance of wearing a mask properly.
Yeah, it was a good picture, actually, that video. Andrew, what about in your neck of the woods? Any anomalies?
Yeah, the anomalies, I think, were when people stepped outside of the Australian value system, you know, and I think that the government in particular used our national values as a marker of how you should behave. So it was, you know, we're egalitarian, where mateship is really important to us, this sense of humility and being one and doing things together and looking after your neighbour, and that kind of stuff is sort of quite ingrained into the Aussie psyche. And then I think in the early days, I don't know if you remember the Bondi Beach parties, where there was just like people just flocking to Bondi Beach one day, and it became a COVID kind of hotspot just after that. And ScoMo came out and stood with his chief medical officer, who was always accompanying him, and he basically just told everyone off. He was like, that is un-Australian. You cannot be doing it. Some of the things I've been seeing is totally un-Australian. You guys have got to get your act together. And it was kind of funny. And actually, rather than people going, oh, well, you know, we'll do what we like, people kind of started to toe the line a bit again. So there became less of those, and there were some flashpoints. There were some real race kind of flashpoints with the Asian kind of population. There was obviously the stockpiling, you know, there were those moments of real kind of individualism. And I think it just showed that the virus had affected people in very different ways. You know, it was not just it was very difficult to make this a singular issue, because it was very fragmented in the way that it was affecting different parts of the population. So to get everybody to toe the line and do the same thing was pretty hard, but bringing it down to a sort of a national values consciousness level, I think was the right thing to do, and it kind of worked. But slightly more difficult in the States, presumably.
Yes, it has been slightly different in the States. I would say extremely different. I mean, and again, I think it goes back to what I said earlier. I mean, this issue, at least at a national level, has been politicized. I think, you know, it's also gotten mixed up, I think, with a much older American narrative, which is, of course, individual rights and freedoms, right, which is so central to a lot of the American psyche, not always, but very often at the you know, to the detriment of our responsibilities, right, to the rest of the community. So what you're seeing here is, again, depending on which leadership we're talking about, right? There are definitely examples of what you guys are talking about, where there is real unity in a state like New York, for example. You know, you're not going to see a lot of people without a mask because, well, first of all, our death toll was so high. So I think that, you know, I think people were in some ways also scared into new behaviors. But there is also that sense of, you know, just duty to the community that I think Governor Cuomo, for example, spoke of. In other states, and I'm sure you've seen this in the news, there's been a real resistance to wearing masks based on these sort of claims of individual liberty, and this is a violation of my rights. So again, it's been quite a mixed bag. Lesley, I think it's really interesting, though, what you were talking about in terms of the community response. I think I can only really speak to New York, but the community response has been tremendous. We also have a crumbling social welfare system. This goes, you know, I mean, long back, but that's really become visible here during the pandemic, and the community has really stepped in terms of soup kitchens, mutual aid societies, you know, people, you know, coming together to help the elderly. So that's definitely been a tremendous help. But I have to say, in New York, a lot of that has also been facilitated by services offered by the states through Governor Cuomo, which hasn't happened as much in other states.
I'm just curious, when Trump put his mask on in public, how did that affect the states that are
I mean, I think a lot of it is too little too late. I mean, I think, I think there is I think at that point it was, you know, well, for most of us, of course, it was perceived as ingenuous, but I think it's also that there's still mixed messages going around, right? I mean, it's still not, yes, he put his mask on in public, but he still has not said that this should be mandatory, or you know, this is something that you do for your community. He's still talking about it in terms of, this is my decision to do this now, thereby leaving it up to individuals to either take that lead or not. And, you know, there's still, you know, you still see a lot of instances of people just refusing.
Yeah. You see it over here as well. Now to one that I'm really looking forward to. Have responses differed according to age, class, gender? Indeed, has the pandemic highlighted deep-seated nation-specific inequities among racial minorities? And we'll turn to you, Lesley, first of all, and I'm curious about your response.
Yeah, this was clear right from the beginning, that the kind of how people were going to be affected by this. There were initially concerns that a highly immunocompromised society with HIV and TB was going to be severely affected. It doesn't look like that is happening so far, although when we had this conversation by email a couple of weeks ago, I checked out just to see what the detailed demographic data was saying, and that it does not exist. It's not there. It's not been released, and that is really interesting. And last night I was listening to something on the radio, and the investigative journalist was saying it's not there out there in the public domain. It was a conscious decision by the health department not to do that through the whole pandemic. They're releasing by age, and they're releasing by if you've got comorbidities, and also by region. And then with the older Part 8 town planning, if they say this particular suburb has got a higher than kind of what you would expect rate, then you know that it's going to be more black people. So I think my perceptions from what I'm reading and what I've kind of dug into is that it is disproportionately affecting black people, but the data isn't showing anything like that yet.
And do you think it will go public in time, or will they continue to?
No, I think it will. And I mean, the guy that I was listening to last night says that they have to, you know, it's got to be out there because there's going to be a huge furore about it. But they didn't want to release it through, for whatever reason, I don't know. And I wasn't even aware of this until I started digging into it. They didn't want to release it through the different stages. What we're seeing, that because the country is a relatively young population, as it is the case in the rest of Africa, compared with Europe and the US, and I would imagine Australia as well. So the peaks of death seem to be amongst the sort of 50 to 65-year-olds rather than the older age groups. But then as soon as you've got comorbidities, then there's lots of younger people dying as well. And there's a lot of diabetes. So as Hester was saying earlier on before we were talking about, if a population is constantly under, you know, living in poor social conditions, their immune system, their body is going to be compromised in some way. So that's where, I mean, the younger people are dying too. But yeah, no figures that I've been able to find anyway.
Thank you. And are there figures in Australia, Andrew?
Well, there are, yes, but the figures, you know, the death rates in Australia have been really low, you know, if I'm honest. So the way that the virus has actually affected people in Australia tends to be, you know, there were clusters in nursing homes. It's really mostly old people, you know, and the virus getting into nursing homes. I think the more interesting thing, like I said before, in Australia, it's definitely the effects of the pandemic, not necessarily the pandemic itself, but the knock-on effects of it have affected people in very different ways. And we ran a sort of a segmentation to try and understand what are there groups of people who have been more or less affected by this, and how do they cluster, and how they're looking like they're going to emerge from COVID. And the key kind of distinctions of, when we put in loads of attitudinal kind of reflections, like this is the reset that we needed, and we need to go back to how we were before. But the main distinctions that people felt were, if they genuinely felt like their safety was going to be compromised going forwards in the future, they really felt like they were likely to get this, or someone in their family was likely to get COVID. And the other one was just concerns about financial security. So in particular on that second one, the spectrum of financial security was the key defining attribute, really. So we had about 20% of people who were safety seekers, who just don't want to go out of the house and are really terrified about this sort of happening again and the second wave. But then you had, I think it was 18% of strugglers who were lower socioeconomic grade, you know, in unstable jobs or no jobs at all. And their response to the pandemic has very much been an individualistic, I'm now in it for myself, I need to look after myself, I need to look after my immediate family. So all that civic mindedness kind of goes out the window a bit when you're actually, you know, trying to basically make ends meet and hunker down. And that has affected minority groups in Australia more than anybody else, by disproportionately more than anybody else. So kind of looking after, and I think the government has done a pretty good job, and the communities around as well, to try and lift that segment of strugglers up and make sure that they're not left behind. But there's certainly, you know, when the George Floyd moment happened in the States, which Hester will talk about in a second, you know, that was a moment where the Indigenous community in Australia certainly found its voice during this pandemic and said, hey, we are one of these disaffected groups. We are not just by the pandemic more affected by, you know, injustice, but we are broadly injustice, and we need to take this moment to make things fairer in the future. And so suddenly, like, the platform was there to have more of a discussion about what kind of Australia we want to have in the future post the pandemic per se, which I think is a really interesting kind of moment in Australian history.
I hope that's replicated over here and elsewhere. I mean, Hester, tell us about America.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the US, you really cannot talk about this pandemic or the impact that it is having or will have in the future without talking about racial inequities. And I think, unlike what Lesley was telling us in South Africa, the statistics are there. It's been I have to say, unlike in previous times in the US, it's been broadly reported on. We know, for example, that Native Americans are about 5 times more likely to be hospitalized than white Americans, 4.7 times more likely among Blacks and Hispanics. The death rate among Latinos and African Americans in particular has been twice as high as it has been among whites. So very, very stark statistics. And I think, what the statistics have brought to the fore is not that these people are somehow more genetically disposed, for example, but that these are, really spotlighting deep-seated inequities. For example, these are minorities tend to be concentrated in low-income service jobs where they have to go out to work. They don't have the option of staying home, at a home office. They have a higher incidence because of, especially in cities like New York, where rents are expensive, of living in overcrowded housing. Where, of course, comorbidities are going to be higher, the spread is going to be higher. They also have a tendency, because of a crumbling healthcare system, social welfare system, to not have access to the kind of healthcare coverage that they need. So you see rates as high as 10 to 15% of Blacks and African Americans, but also Native American, Blacks, Latinos, but also Native Americans not having any coverage at all, right? So this is something that then feeds into how they're going to be affected by the pandemic, and I think, another thing to understand is that people talk about, well, these are populations that have higher rates of diabetes, for example, already, or they have higher rates of, high blood pressure already, which makes them more susceptible. But that, of course, in itself is a manifestation of inequities. First of all, these are people that do not very often have access to proper healthcare or nutritious food. But these are also, what scientists are, talking more and more about, people that are subject to what is called racial wearing, which means that, the bodily effect of discrimination, low income, and the stressors that come with that, which might actually age a person, right? So that, you might be a 30-year-old man, that technically is, and I think Lesley is saying something similar, that is technically not susceptible to death from corona, but in biological terms, they're actually 55 years old. So, and I think what all this, I think it's, it's not surprising that Black Lives Matter exploded the way that it did in the United States in this particular moment. Yes, of course, it would have happened anyways. The death of George Floyd was, of course, an instigator, but of course, these deaths, unfortunately, in the US are daily occurrences. So I think the moment of, that death occurring in the midst of a pandemic that was already disproportionately affecting minorities and kind of surfacing racial inequities has really brought, discrimination to the fore more broadly, not just in terms of, Black Lives Matter in policing, but Black Lives Matter in healthcare, Black Lives Matter in housing, Black Lives Matter in employment. And I know that there will be a question about what might be some of the positives that might come out of this pandemic. To me, of course, all of these statistics are negative. These deaths are negative, but the fact that this is now a national discussion
is a positive.
Is a positive, is something that I think that America hasn't ventured into this extent before, with quite a lot of unity around it across racial boundaries, which to me is the positive impact.
But we always have the saying that talk is cheap. Can we move on from the talk to something more positive?
Yeah.
In terms of our society. I mean, what do you reckon, Lesley?
Yeah, well, I think same kind of issues in terms of it's highlighted the big chasms in society, and I think that is going to be something that is going to be talked about in the future. But also the positive things, like we've been forced into this digital age. We've been forced to be having to use online to communicate so much more because we've not been able to get out and about. I think that's going to be a big positive for the future. But I think ultimately the economy, certainly in this country, is going to take a hell of a long time to recover. It was already in a difficult situation before. There's already a lot of corruption. There was already a lot of kind of negativity against the government and parts of the cabinet and their connections with corruption. So it's brought a lot of that to the fore because there's been a lot more of that going on over the last couple of months. So yeah, so it is going to take time for the economy to recover, but things like getting more involved, getting more access to digital, to the digital kind of connection to the world is going to affect business. And I think another interesting thing that is going to be affected in South Africa is the funeral. And it's a bizarre thing to be talking about, but in South Africa, they're usually massive community affairs. A lot of kind of high fashion, a lot of showing off, but a lot of kind of traditional rituals that go into them as well. And with the COVID regulations in place, funerals were not allowed to have more than 50 people in them. And inevitably, funerals in the past would have been 100, 200, 300 people, all in a big tent or whatever. But because it has to be 50 people, and I've been talking to lots of different people about this, and they've said that as weird as it is, it's forced people to reconsider or rethink what the focus of, what the importance of a funeral is, what it's about, what it's for, that it's not about this whole fashion scene. It's not about this big community social event. It's about focusing on the dead person and the dead person's family, as difficult as the situation might be. And I've had a lot of people say that they hope that when things get back to some kind of normal, that refocus will stay in place, which is quite interesting because it's always been such a massive part of the community.
It's looking at the things that matter, really. Press pause and rethink.
Yeah.
What about you, Andrew? Do you think
that was fascinating? I mean, the idea of rewriting some cultural rituals that are so deeply ingrained in the national psyche, and this moment being able to, for people to do that, that to take some of those things, those institutions, and go, well, can we reimagine that? I think is really interesting. And I think in Australia, I mean, to answer the question, yes, I think there's a real sense of hope and optimism if you scratch beneath the surface of all of the doom and gloom. I think I read this quote the other day. It said, I think it was in the Washington Post actually, it said the pandemic has expanded the spectrum of imaginable futures and political possibilities. And there's just that sense of kind of the widening of what could be possible on the other side of this. And I think definitely feels like we're at an inflection point, as I said before, in Australia across a number of different kind of fault lines and things that maybe need to be sorted out once and for all. Probably the biggest conversation which was happening pre-COVID and is still accelerating is around sustainability, if you want to call it that in inverted commas, because the bushfires, with such a lot of, problems in the natural world in Australia, and the fact that we're so reliant on fossil fuels and we're digging it up and selling it to China constantly. You know, there was a lot of political heat on that, and you know, that now to be gripped in coronavirus, and I think that's a sort of a fault line that we're grappling with, you know, in terms of coming out of this on the other side. And there was a brilliant documentary maker called Damon Gameau who made this documentary called 2040, where he sort of imagined those new possibilities for a new world, but a new Australia, just using what is currently available. So not just imagining things that aren't there, it's like new futures based on networked, sustainable kind of solar panels, and you know, all kinds of different things. And he painted a really incredible picture of what our society could be if we lean into new sustainable technologies, if we lean into universal prosperity, if we you know, we treasure our local communities and our supply chains, all of that sort of thing. But there's a lot of political questions that need to be answered before we get to that point.
Aren't there always? So in the States, can we convert talk into action?
You know, I mean, I think in the States, I mean, I think at a local level, just, you know, to revisit you know, what I had said earlier about Black Lives Matter, I think, you know, I think it is. I mean, there are conversations going on, for example, with police departments and to reform police union contracts, which a lot of times, for example, protect police officers from you know, any sort of consequences in the wake of violence, for example. But I think at a national level, though, you know, and I think most of you are aware, we are in the middle of an election year, and so much of what our future holds is going to depend on that moment. You know, I think, you know, at this point, it's very unclear. We could go into one of two directions. So I think with the present administration, I think there's not going to be a lot of hope that these types of inequities that I talked about are truly going to be addressed. So, you know, so it's really one of two possible futures, I think. I think you know, and to revisit the consequences, I just want to think about it economically for a second. I think what's happened in the States, because we do not have a social welfare system like European countries do, is that there's really been a development of two economies, right? You have the sort of white collar economy that stays at home, works, and really hasn't been economically affected by this pandemic. And then you have those that are experiencing a deep, deep recession, right? So it's not like any other recession we've ever had, in a way, because it's so differentially impacting people. You know, if that disparity and these two economies are not righted, right? It's hard for me not to be cynical, if that makes sense. I'm trying to be optimistic, but again, I do think, you know, the next 2 months will tell us where we'll land, honestly. 2-3 months.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, yeah.
We've probably come to the end of our session. We've only touched on some of the questions that we devised beforehand, but we have had one come in, which I think you've probably covered a wee bit, all of you, but I'll read it out anyway. Do you see COVID impacting wider industry and the way we rebuild those industries, such as energy, aviation, fossil fuel usage, transition to electric vehicles, etc.? Is the idea of sustainability going to be more important going forward? Now, I can hear your answer to that, Andrew, before you come on. It will be yes. So I'm just wondering whether to start with Hester and work backwards. What do you reckon, Hester?
I mean, it's kind of been interesting. I actually just yesterday, I read an article about sustainability in particular. Of course, again, our administration has not exactly been pro-sustainability. So again, that future will rely on the administration. But what they were pointing out is that actually in the other than saying like when we went into lockdown, I mean, people were discussing isn't the air cleaner, et cetera. And there was a sort of felt sort of sense that look what we could do, right, if we just stopped for a moment. But other than that, I think the debates have been so over sustainability, unfortunately, have been so overtaken by other very pressing matters, our political situation, our racial divides, which really have been top of mind in the news cycle, but also actually within companies, right? So companies right now are, large companies are not so much talking about sustainable futures as they're talking about diversity and, basically diverse work cultures and the future of that rather than sustainability issues, which is alarming, because I do think there is a potential moment right now to talk about that, but it just hasn't come to the surface as much in the United States.
Yeah, it's happening over here as well. There's an article in the Times today. Lesley, to you before Andrew, and then we'll clear up.
I'd say the same thing. I think there are way bigger issues. I mean, sustainability. I mean, how much bigger can you get? But there are issues of people just being hungry, the economy taking a complete nosedive. That's what is going to be the focus of the government, the immediate focus of the government. Sustainability wasn't really a kind of a high priority before, and it's not going to be now, unfortunately.
Andrew?
Yeah, interesting. I think in Australia there was a burning platform, literally, and it was a really high priority, and businesses were starting to take it very, very seriously, kind of pre-COVID. And I've noticed that they're picking it back up again now in the kind of general narrative, and there is a sense of, we need to show consumers that we are, we have sustainable packaging, or we're contributing some way to the triple bottom line. It feels like it's a movement that's very much kind of gathering pace. Whether or not it's always a difficult one, because there are other pressing priorities. And like I said before, 20% of people are struggling and just they're not gonna make those choices anyway. It doesn't matter to them. So whether we're able to make the steps now to rebuild parts of our economy like energy and aviation and travel and remold them, we have the opportunity to do it now. So I think, and there's quite a few kind of voices out there that are pushing for that at fairly high levels in Australia. So I'm sure it's going to continue to sort of gather momentum, but it needs constant kind of fueling, which is the difficulty. But I would recommend that documentary 2040. Just have a look at that, and that shows a kind of a bunch of different possibilities for those industries that are based in fact and reality. It's quite uplifting. It's quite inspiring, actually.
Thank you. Well, thank you all three of you very much. I've enjoyed it. I hope the people who've been watching out there have been as well. And maybe at some point we'll have an opportunity to do Elephant Part 2. But let's hope they focus, the governments that be focus on the right things. Good luck with the election. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.